The rain fell hard on the streets of Montgomery, Alabama, turning the dusty roads into muddy rivers. Margaret Thompson hurried down the sidewalk, clutching her worn leather purse close to her chest. At 62 years old, she had seen many storms in her life, but tonight felt different somehow. The year was 1955, and tensions in the South were running high. Margaret worked as a seamstress in the local textile factory, earning just enough to pay rent on her small apartment above the bakery. She lived alone since her husband died in the war 10 years ago, and her days were filled with the steady rhythm of her sewing machine and the quiet comfort of her evening prayers. As she turned the corner near the bus station, she noticed a young man in military uniform standing under a broken streetlight. He was soaking wet, shivering in the cold rain, and looked completely lost. His dark skin glistened with raindrops, and his army bag sat on the wet ground beside him. Margaret could see he was trying to read something in his hand, probably an address or directions, but the paper was getting destroyed by the rain. Most people walked past him without a second glance. Some crossed the street entirely when they saw him standing there. Margaret knew why. In 1955 Montgomery, a black soldier standing alone at night made many white folks nervous. But Margaret saw something different. She saw a young man who looked scared, cold, and far from home. She slowed her pace and watched him for a moment. He couldn't be more than 20 years old, she thought. Maybe someone's son trying to find his way. The rain was getting worse, and she could see him getting more frustrated as he tried to protect the wet paper in his hands. Margaret had always believed that kindness didn't see color. Her mother had taught her that before she died, and her husband had lived by the same principle. But believing it and acting on it were two very different things, especially in Montgomery in 1955. She took a deep breath and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Walking up to the young soldier, she pulled out her small umbrella and held it over both of them. "Son, you look like you could use some help," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the sound of the rain hitting the pavement. The young man looked up, surprised that someone had actually spoken to him. His eyes were filled with relief and gratitude, but also caution. He had learned to be careful about accepting help from white people in the South. "Ma'am, I'm trying to find Dexter Avenue, but this address got all wet and I can't read it anymore," he said, showing her the soggy piece of paper. Margaret squinted at the paper and could make out a few numbers. "That's about 6 blocks from here, but it's a rough walk in this weather. You'll catch your death of cold walking that far in this rain." The young soldier, whose name was James Washington, had been traveling for 3 days to reach Montgomery. He was supposed to report to a new assignment the next morning, but his bus had broken down 50 miles outside the city. He'd managed to catch a ride with a trucker, but now he was stranded in the rain with no idea how to find his temporary housing. Margaret looked at this young man and saw her own son, who had died in Korea 4 years earlier. She remembered how she had prayed every night that if her boy was ever lost and scared somewhere far from home, a kind stranger would help him find his way. Without thinking about the consequences or what her neighbors might say, Margaret made an offer that surprised them both. "Listen, son, my apartment is just 2 blocks away. You can come dry off, get some hot coffee, and I'll help you figure out how to get where you need to go. It's not safe for you to be wandering around in this storm." James hesitated. He knew the risks of accepting help from a white woman in Alabama. But the rain was getting worse, he was freezing cold, and something in Margaret's voice told him she was genuine. "Ma'am, I don't want to cause you any trouble," he said carefully. Margaret smiled for the first time that evening. "Son, the only trouble tonight is this storm. Come on, let's get you somewhere warm and dry." As they walked together under her small umbrella, neither Margaret nor James could have imagined how this simple act of human kindness would ripple through their lives and touch the hearts of people they had never met. Sometimes the smallest gestures create the biggest changes, and sometimes helping a stranger in the rain opens doors that were meant to stay closed forever. Margaret's small apartment was warm and cozy, filled with the smell of fresh bread from the bakery downstairs. She quickly grabbed a clean towel from her linen closet and handed it to James, then bustled around the tiny kitchen making coffee. The young soldier stood awkwardly by the door, still dripping wet and unsure if he should sit down. "Don't just stand there catching pneumonia," Margaret said with a gentle smile. "Sit yourself down at that kitchen table and get yourself dry." James carefully removed his wet army jacket and hung it on the back of the chair. As he dried his hair with the towel, he looked around the modest apartment. Family photographs lined the mantelpiece, and a small American flag sat in a frame next to a picture of a young man in military uniform. Margaret noticed him looking at the photograph. "That was my boy, Michael," she said quietly, pouring hot coffee into two mismatched cups. "Lost him in Korea back in '51. "I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am," James said respectfully. "He looks like he was a good soldier." "He was," Margaret replied, her voice thick with emotion. "Just like you, I imagine." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, sipping the strong, hot coffee. Margaret studied James's face and saw intelligence, determination, and something else. A quiet dignity that reminded her of her late husband. "Where you from, son?" she asked. "Detroit, Michigan, ma'am. Born and raised there until I enlisted 2 years ago." James wrapped his hands around the warm cup, grateful for both the heat and the kindness. "My mama would have your hide if she knew I was dripping water all over a nice lady's floor." Margaret laughed, a genuine sound that filled the small kitchen. "Your mama raised you right, I can tell. What's your assignment here in Montgomery?" James explained that he was being transferred to Maxwell Air Force Base, just outside the city. He was a mechanic, specializing in aircraft engines, and had been selected for an advanced training program. It was a big opportunity for a young black man in 1955, and he was nervous about making a good impression. "My commanding officer back in Georgia told me this assignment could change my whole career," James said, his eyes bright with hope. "If I do well here, I might get recommended for officer training school." Margaret felt a surge of pride for this young man she barely knew. She could see the determination in his face, the same look her son used to get when he talked about his dreams for the future. "Well then, we better make sure you get a good night's sleep and show up looking sharp tomorrow," she said practically. "That couch pulls out into a bed and I've got extra blankets in the closet." James started to protest, but Margaret held up her hand. "I won't hear any arguments. It's still pouring rain out there and you don't know this city. You'll spend half the night wandering around in circles and show up tomorrow looking like something the cat dragged in." As Margaret prepared the makeshift bed, James called the base from her telephone to report his delayed arrival. The officer on duty was understanding and confirmed that James should report to Building 12 at 800 hours the next morning. "Thank you, ma'am," James said as Margaret handed him a spare pillow. "I don't know how to repay your kindness." "You repay it by being the best soldier you can be," Margaret replied firmly. "And by remembering that when you see someone else who needs help someday, you do the same thing." That night, as Margaret lay in her bed listening to the rain against her window, she thought about the young man sleeping on her couch. She wondered what her neighbors would say if they knew. But she found that she didn't much care. For the first time since her son died, she felt like she had done something that really mattered. In the living room, James stared at the ceiling, amazed by the unexpected turn his evening had taken. He had been prepared for hostility or indifference in Montgomery, not genuine kindness from a white woman who treated him like family. His mother had always told him that good people existed everywhere, but he hadn't expected to find proof of it on his first night in Alabama. Neither of them could sleep very well, both wondering if they would see each other again after tomorrow morning. Margaret found herself hoping that James would stop by sometime to let her know how his training was going. James wondered if it would be appropriate to send Mrs. Thompson a thank you card or maybe some flowers. As dawn approached, the rain finally stopped, and a new day began to unfold. Neither Margaret nor James had any idea that their paths were destined to cross again, much sooner than either of them imagined, and that their brief encounter was only the beginning of a story that would touch many more lives than just their own. The next morning dawned clear and bright, as if the storm had washed the world clean. Margaret woke early, as was her habit, and quietly started breakfast while James was still sleeping on the couch. The smell of bacon and fresh biscuits filled the small apartment, and she could hear him stirring as the sun streamed through her kitchen window. "Good morning, son," she called softly. "I've got breakfast ready if you're hungry." James sat up, momentarily confused about where he was, then remembered the events of the previous night. He had slept better than he had in weeks, feeling safe and welcomed in this stranger's home. He folded the blankets neatly and straightened the couch cushions before joining Margaret in the kitchen. "Ma'am, you didn't need to go to all this trouble," he said, looking at the generous breakfast she had prepared. "Nonsense," Margaret replied, filling his plate with scrambled eggs, bacon, and warm biscuits. "A soldier needs a good breakfast before starting his first day." My Michael always said the army coffee was terrible, so you better get some decent food in you while you can. As they ate together, James told Margaret more about his family back in Detroit. His father worked in the Ford plant, and his mother was a teacher at the local elementary school. He had two younger sisters who were both excellent students and planned to attend college. His family had high hopes for his military career, seeing it as a path to opportunities that weren't available to many black families in the 1950s. Margaret shared stories about her life in Montgomery, her work at the textile factory, and the community she had built over the years. She mentioned her church, where she sang in the choir every Sunday, and the small garden she tended behind the building where she grew vegetables to share with her elderly neighbors. "You remind me so much of my Michael," Margaret said as she poured him a second cup of coffee. "He had that same quiet confidence, that same respectful way of speaking. He would have liked you." James felt a lump form in his throat. His own grandmother had passed away the year before, and he realized how much he had missed having an older woman fuss over him and treat him like family. At 7:30, Margaret insisted on walking with James to the bus stop to make sure he caught the right bus to Maxwell Air Force Base. She had written down clear directions on a piece of paper and even drawn a small map, showing him where to transfer buses. "Now you call me tonight and let me know how your first day went," she said, pressing a piece of paper with her telephone number into his hand. "And if you need anything at all, you just let me know." James promised he would call, though he wasn't sure if it would be appropriate. He had never met anyone quite like Margaret Thompson, someone who showed such genuine care for a complete stranger without expecting anything in return. As his bus pulled up, Margaret surprised him by giving him a quick hug. "You make me proud today, you hear?" she said firmly. James boarded the bus with a smile on his face and confidence in his step. The other passengers stared as he found a seat in the back, but he barely noticed. His mind was focused on the day ahead and the opportunity that awaited him at Maxwell Air Force Base. Margaret walked back to her apartment feeling lighter than she had in months. She realized that helping James had filled an empty place in her heart that she hadn't even recognized was there. For the first time since Michael's death, she felt like she had a purpose beyond just getting through each day. At the textile factory that morning, Margaret found herself humming as she worked at her sewing machine. Her supervisor, Mrs. Henderson, noticed her unusually cheerful mood and commented on it during their lunch break. "You're certainly in good spirits today, Margaret," Mrs. Henderson observed. "Did something special happen?" Margaret hesitated for a moment, then decided to share her story. She told Mrs. Henderson about finding James in the rain and helping him find shelter for the night. To her surprise, Mrs. Henderson listened without judgment and even seemed moved by the story. "That was a brave thing to do," Mrs. Henderson said quietly. "Not many people would have taken that risk, especially these days." Margaret realized that her simple act of kindness had been braver than she had thought at the time. In 1955 Montgomery, where racial tensions were high and social rules were strictly enforced, helping a black soldier could have serious consequences for a white woman living alone. But as she returned to her sewing machine that afternoon, Margaret felt certain that she had made the right choice. Sometimes doing what's right requires courage, and sometimes courage comes from simply treating another person with the respect and kindness that every human being deserves. That evening, as Margaret prepared a simple dinner for herself, she found herself listening for the telephone to ring. She had given James her number, but she wasn't sure if he would actually call. Part of her hoped he would, and part of her worried about what complications might arise from maintaining contact with him. At exactly 6 o'clock, the phone rang. Margaret's heart skipped a beat when she heard James's voice on the other end of the line. He sounded excited and grateful, eager to share the news of his successful first day at Maxwell Air Force Base. "Mrs. Thompson, I can't thank you enough for everything you did for me," James said, his voice filled with genuine appreciation. "My first day went better than I could have imagined." James told her about meeting his new commanding officer, Captain Williams, who had been impressed by his punctuality and professional appearance. He had been assigned to work on a new type of jet engine that was being tested at the base, and his supervisor had already complimented his mechanical skills and attention to detail. "The best part is," James continued, "Captain Williams told me that if I keep up the good work, he'll recommend me for the advanced training program I was hoping for. None of this would have happened if you hadn't helped me last night." Margaret, felt a warm glow of satisfaction hearing about James's success. She had spent the day thinking about him and hoping that her small act of kindness would lead to good things for the young soldier. "I'm so proud of you, James," she said, using his name for the first time. "But you earned that praise all on your own. I just made sure you got there dry and well-fed." James laughed, and Margaret could hear the relief and joy in his voice. "My mama always said that sometimes angels come in unexpected forms. I think she was right about that." Over the next few weeks, James called Margaret every few days to check in and share news about his training. She looked forward to these conversations more than she cared to admit, and found herself planning her evenings around his calls. James, meanwhile, had begun thinking of Margaret as a kind of surrogate family member in Montgomery, someone who cared about his success and well-being. One evening in late October, James called with particularly exciting news. He had been selected for the Advanced Officer Training Program and would be leaving Montgomery in 2 weeks to attend a special school in Colorado. It was exactly the opportunity he had been hoping for when he first arrived in Alabama. "I want to take you to dinner before I leave," James said. "I know it might be complicated, but I'd like to find a way to thank you properly." Margaret was touched by the offer, but she knew that a black soldier and a white woman dining together in Montgomery would create exactly the kind of attention neither of them wanted. Instead, she suggested that James come to her apartment for a farewell dinner, that she would cook herself. "I make a pretty good pot roast," she said with a smile in her voice. "And nobody has to know anything except that a kind young man came to visit a lonely old woman." The following Sunday evening, James arrived at Margaret's apartment carrying a small bouquet of flowers in a beautifully wrapped package. Margaret had spent the entire day cooking his favorite meal, which she had learned about during their many phone conversations. "These are for you," James said, presenting the flowers with a formal little bow that made Margaret laugh. "And what's in that mysterious package?" she asked, leading him into the kitchen where the table was set with her best dishes. "Just a little, something I thought you might like," James replied. But he seemed nervous about whatever was inside. As they enjoyed the delicious meal together, they talked about James's plans for Colorado and his hopes for the future. He spoke about wanting to make his family proud and someday using his military training to start his own business. Margaret shared more stories about her late husband and son, and James could see how much she missed having family around. After dinner, James finally worked up the courage to give Margaret his gift. Inside the package was a beautiful photograph of James in his dress uniform, professionally taken at the Base Photography Studio. On the back, he had written, "To Mrs. Margaret Thompson, who taught me that kindness has no color. With deepest gratitude and respect, James Washington." Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes as she looked at the photograph. "This is the most thoughtful gift anyone has ever given me," she said softly. "I'm going to put it right here on the mantelpiece next to Michael's picture." As the evening drew to a close, both Margaret and James knew that this might be the last time they would see each other. James's new assignment would likely lead to other opportunities that would take him far from Montgomery, and Margaret's quiet life in Alabama would probably continue much as it always had. "You've changed my life in ways you'll probably never understand," James said as he prepared to leave. "I'll never forget what you did for me, and I promise I'll always try to help others the way you helped me." Margaret hugged him goodbye, feeling like she was saying farewell to another son. "You write to me from Colorado and let me know how you're doing," she said firmly. "And remember that you'll always have a friend here in Montgomery." Neither of them could have predicted that this wouldn't be their final goodbye, and that forces beyond their control were already setting in motion events that would bring them back together in the most unexpected way possible. 3 years passed, and Margaret had settled back into her quiet routine in Montgomery. She received letters from James regularly at first, filled with news about his training in Colorado and later his assignment to an air base in California. The letters came less frequently as time went on, but Margaret treasured each one and kept them in a special box with Michael's war letters. James had been promoted to lieutenant and was now training other mechanics in advanced aircraft maintenance. His letters told of his engagement to a lovely young teacher named Sarah, whom he had met at a USO dance in San Diego. Margaret felt genuinely happy for him. though she sometimes missed their long phone conversations and the sense of purpose his friendship had given her. Life in Montgomery had continued much the same for Margaret, with work at the textile factory and quiet evenings in her apartment. The racial tensions in the city had grown worse since the bus boycott had begun the previous December, and Margaret often thought about James and wondered how he was handling the changes happening across the country. One Tuesday morning in March 1958, Margaret woke to an unusual commotion outside her apartment building. She looked out her window to see several official-looking cars parked on the street, and men in military uniforms talking to her landlord, Mr. Patterson, near the bakery entrance. Margaret dressed quickly and went downstairs to see what was happening. Mr. Patterson looked nervous and kept glancing up at her apartment window as he spoke with the uniformed men. "Mrs. Thompson," Mr. Patterson called when he saw her. "These gentlemen are looking for you. They say it's official army business." Margaret's heart began to race. Her first thought was that something terrible had happened to James, and these officers were here to deliver bad news. She had received similar visits when Michael was killed in Korea, and the sight of military uniforms still made her stomach turn. A tall African-American officer approached her with a respectful but serious expression. Margaret was surprised to see a black officer in Montgomery, especially one who carried himself with such obvious authority and confidence. "Mrs. Thompson, my name is Colonel Robert Hayes," the officer said politely. "I wonder if we might speak privately about a matter of great importance to the United States Army." Margaret invited the officers up to her apartment, her mind racing with possibilities. Colonel Hayes was accompanied by two other officers, one white and one black, both of whom treated him with clear deference and respect. Once they were seated in Margaret's small living room, Colonel Hayes began to explain the purpose of their visit. Margaret noticed him glance at the photograph of James on her mantelpiece, and something in his expression changed slightly. "Mrs. Thompson, we're here because of Lieutenant James Washington," Colonel Hayes began. "I understand that you know him personally." Margaret's heart sank, convinced that something awful had happened to James. "Is he hurt? Is he in trouble?" she asked anxiously. "No, ma'am, quite the opposite," Colonel Hayes replied with a small smile. "Lieutenant Washington has been selected for a very special assignment, one that will require the highest level of security clearance. As part of that process, we investigate everyone who has had significant contact with the candidate." Margaret was confused. "I don't understand what my friendship with James has to do with his military assignment." Colonel Hayes leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Thompson, Lieutenant Washington has been chosen to be part of an elite team that will work on classified aircraft technology. It's cutting-edge work that could change the future of military aviation. But before he can accept this assignment, we need to verify that all of his associations and friendships are with people of unquestionable character and loyalty." Margaret still didn't understand why they were telling her all of this, until Colonel Hayes continued. "Lieutenant Washington has listed you as his emergency contact and has spoken extensively about how you helped him when he was a young soldier new to Montgomery. In his interview, he said that you taught him what it means to treat all people with dignity and respect, regardless of their background. He credits you with shaping his character in ways that made him the kind of officer the Army wants to promote." Margaret felt a flush of pride mixed with embarrassment. She had no idea that her simple act of kindness had meant so much to James or that he had spoken about her to his superiors. "What do you need to know?" Margaret asked simply. For the next hour, Colonel Hayes and his colleagues asked Margaret detailed questions about her relationship with James, her background, her family, and her life in Montgomery. They wanted to know about her late husband's military service, her work at the textile factory, and her reputation in the community. Margaret answered every question honestly, though she was puzzled by some of them. They asked about her views on integration, her relationships with black neighbors and co-workers, and whether she had ever been involved in any political activities. Finally, Colonel Hayes asked the question that surprised Margaret most of all. "Mrs. Thompson, how would you feel about relocating to California to work for the United States Army?" Margaret stared at him in complete bewilderment. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "Lieutenant Washington's new assignment will last for several years and it's extremely demanding work. The Army has found that soldiers in high-stress positions perform better when they have strong support systems. We're prepared to offer you a position as a civilian contractor, working with families of military personnel who are involved in classified projects. Margaret couldn't believe what she was hearing. You want me to move to California to work for the Army? Your background check shows that you have exactly the qualities we're looking for, Colonel Hayes explained. You're trustworthy, discreet, and have a natural ability to provide emotional support to people under stress. Lieutenant Washington speaks very highly of your character, and frankly, we need more people like you in our organization. Margaret sat in stunned silence, trying to process this unexpected turn in her life. After 3 years of routine and predictability, the Army was offering her a chance to start completely over in a new place, doing work that actually mattered. Margaret stared at Colonel Hayes, trying to absorb the magnitude of what he was offering her. At 65 years old, she had never imagined that her life could take such a dramatic turn. The idea of leaving Montgomery, the only home she had ever known, seemed both terrifying and thrilling. I need to think about this, Margaret said slowly. When would you need an answer? We understand this is a big decision, Colonel Hayes replied kindly. We can give you 2 weeks to consider our offer. But I should mention that Lieutenant Washington specifically requested that we approach you for this position. He believes you would be perfect for this kind of work. After the officers left, Margaret sat alone in her apartment, looking around at the life she had built over decades. The photographs on her mantelpiece told the story of her past: her wedding picture, Michael in his Army uniform, and James's graduation photo from officer training school. For the first time since her husband and son died, she had been offered something that felt like a real future. That evening, Margaret called her sister Ruth in Birmingham to discuss the unexpected opportunity. Ruth was amazed by the story and encouraged Margaret to seriously consider the offer. Margaret, you've been just existing for the past 7 years, Ruth said honestly. This could be your chance to really live again. Besides, that young man obviously thinks the world of you, and it sounds like the Army genuinely needs what you have to offer. Over the next week, Margaret thought carefully about the decision. She visited Michael's grave at the Montgomery Cemetery and had a long conversation with her late son, asking him what he thought she should do. She could almost hear his voice encouraging her to take the chance and see what adventures life still held for her. She also thought about James and how their brief encounter had changed both their lives in ways neither of them could have predicted. Her simple act of helping a stranger in the rain had set in motion a series of events that had led to this moment. It seemed like the universe was telling her that their connection was meant to be more than just a memory. 2 weeks later, Colonel Hayes returned to Montgomery for Margaret's answer. She met him at the small cafe near the bus station, where she had first encountered James on that rainy night 3 years earlier. Colonel Hayes, I accept your offer, Margaret said with quiet determination. When do I start? 6 weeks later, Margaret found herself on a train bound for California, carrying 2 suitcases and a heart full of nervous excitement. The Army had arranged for her housing near Edwards Air Force Base, where she would work as a family liaison counselor for military personnel involved in classified projects. James was waiting for her at the train station in Los Angeles, wearing his lieutenant's uniform and accompanied by a beautiful young woman who could only be his fiancée, Sarah. When Margaret stepped off the train, James swept her up in a bear hug that lifted her feet off the ground. Mrs. Thompson, I can't believe you actually came, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I've missed you so much. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face as she hugged the young man who had become like a son to her. I've missed you too, James, more than you know. Sarah welcomed Margaret warmly, thanking her for the kindness she had shown James and telling her how often James had spoken about the woman who had changed his life. The 3 of them drove through the California landscape toward Margaret's new home and new life. Margaret's work with the Army turned out to be exactly what she had been meant to do. She counseled wives whose husbands were away on dangerous missions, helped children adjust to frequent moves, and provided emotional support to families dealing with the stress of military life. Her natural compassion and hard-earned wisdom made her invaluable to the community. James and Sarah married 6 months later, and Margaret walked James down the aisle in place of his father, who couldn't afford to make the trip from Detroit. At the reception, James gave a speech thanking Margaret for teaching him that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about people who choose to care for each other. Years later, When Margaret finally retired from her work with the Army, she had helped hundreds of military families through difficult times. She had found love again with a widowed colonel named Frank, and had been present for the births of James and Sarah's 3 children, all of whom called her Grandma Margaret. On her 80th birthday, surrounded by the large extended family she had somehow acquired in California, Margaret reflected on how a simple decision to help a stranger in the rain had transformed her entire life. She had learned that kindness is never wasted, that courage comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most unexpected encounters lead to the most meaningful relationships. The last photograph added to her mantelpiece was a picture of her whole California family, James and Sarah, their children, Frank, and dozens of other military families she had helped over the years. In the center of the group photo sat Margaret herself, smiling broadly and surrounded by the love she had found by simply choosing to treat a scared young soldier with dignity and compassion on one rainy night in Montgomery, Alabama. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create ripples that reach farther than we ever imagined, touching lives and changing futures in ways we never could have planned.